The Greek Civil War did not begin as a Cold War conflict, yet it became one of the earliest and most decisive battles in shaping how the Cold War would be fought, revealing that the struggle between superpowers would not be confined to borders or treaties, but would unfold inside fractured societies emerging from occupation, collapse, and ideological exhaustion. Because when Greece emerged from World War II, it did so not as a liberated nation ready for reconstruction, but as a country shattered by famine, occupation, and internal division, where resistance against Nazi rule had empowered rival political movements that no longer shared a common vision of the state. During the Axis occupation, communist-led resistance groups had grown into the most organized and effective military force in the country, filling the vacuum left by a discredited pre-war political system and creating parallel structures of authority in liberated Almanatic, while conservative and monarchist factions, many of whom had fled or remained passive during occupation, retained recognition from the government in exile and backing from Britain, setting the stage for a post-war struggle over legitimacy rather than simple governance. The moment German forces withdrew in 1944, Greece did not transition into peace but into confrontation, as competing claims to power collided in the streets of Athens, exposing how liberation had resolved nothing about who would rule or what kind of state would emerge. Britain, exhausted but determined to preserve influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, intervened decisively on behalf of the existing government and monarchy, viewing Greece as strategically indispensable to post-war stability and maritime control, and interpreting communist dominance of the resistance as a threat not only to Greece, but to the fragile balance of power across the region. The December 1944 clashes in Athens, where British forces fought against former resistance fighters, marked a turning point in modern history because they demonstrated that wartime allies were now willing to confront one another militarily over political outcomes, foreshadowing the logic that would soon define the Cold War. Although these early clashes ended with a temporary political settlement, the underlying divisions only deepened as demobilization disarmed one side unevenly, political repression targeted leftist supporters, and cycles of retaliation hardened attitudes across the countryside. The rural population, already devastated by war and famine, became the primary terrain of struggle. As armed bands reformed, state authority remained weak outside major cities, and fear replaced trust as the organizing principle of everyday life. By 1946, violence had escalated into full civil war, not declared openly at first, but unfolding through assassinations, reprisals, and localized fighting that reflected the fragmentation of authority and the collapse of political compromise. This escalation occurred precisely as the global post-war order was being negotiated, turning Greece into an unintended test case for how the emerging superpower rivalry would handle internal conflicts in strategically sensitive states. For the United States, Greece became the moment when containment shifted from theory to practice, as policymakers concluded that instability driven by poverty and political polarization could open the door to communist expansion without direct Soviet invasion, a fear crystallized by Britain's announcement that it could no longer sustain financial and military support for the Greek government. This withdrawal forced Washington to choose between disengagement and intervention, and the decision to intervene marked a defining moment in Cold War history because it framed civil conflict not as a domestic tragedy, but as a front in a global ideological struggle. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, explicitly cited Greece as justification for American involvement, transforming a complex civil war into a symbolic battleground between freedom and totalitarianism, a framing that simplified reality while legitimizing extensive foreign intervention. This intervention reshaped the war itself as American aid, advisors, and resources strengthened the Greek government forces, professionalized their operations, and altered the balance of power, while the communist-led Democratic Army of Greece relied on external support that was far more limited and politically constrained. Despite popular assumptions, the Soviet Union played a cautious and indirect role, constrained by wartime agreements, regional priorities, and a desire to avoid direct confrontation so soon after World War II, leaving local communist forces increasingly isolated as the conflict intensified. Neighboring socialist states provided sanctuary and limited assistance, but this support lacked the scale and coherence necessary to offset American-backed government forces, revealing how asymmetries in external sponsorship could determine the fate of internal wars. The Greek Civil War thus exposed a central pattern of the Cold War, that local conflicts would be shaped decisively by the willingness and capacity of external powers to intervene, and that ideological alignment mattered less than strategic value in determining where resources would flow. The fighting itself grew increasingly brutal, as both sides adopted tactics that blurred the line between combatant and civilian, deepening trauma and embedding fear into the social fabric, while political language hardened into absolutes that left little room for reconciliation. Entire villages were displaced, families divided, and generations marked by exile, imprisonment, and silence, consequences that would outlast the war itself and shape Greek society for decades. By the late 1940s, the outcome of the conflict was becoming clear. Not because one vision had won popular consent, but because external power had tilted the balance decisively, ensuring that the state emerging from the war would be aligned firmly with the Western Bloc. This alignment came at immense human cost, as victory required not only military defeat of the insurgency, but the suppression of alternative political futures, embedding authoritarian practices into the post-war order and delaying democratic normalization. The Greek Civil War therefore stands as the Cold War before the Cold War had a name, a conflict that revealed how global rivalry would penetrate domestic politics, redefine sovereignty, and transform social fractures into strategic liabilities, setting a precedent for decades of proxy struggles to come and marking the moment when peace in Europe gave way to a new kind of war fought not between states, but within them. As the Greek Civil War intensified after 1947, it moved from a fragmented struggle into a fully militarized confrontation shaped decisively by external doctrine, logistical asymmetry, and the emerging architecture of Cold War intervention. Because once the United States committed itself to preventing a communist victory in Greece, the conflict ceased to be an internal contest over political legitimacy and became instead a proving ground for containment as a global strategy, where success or failure would signal how the post-war world would be ordered. American involvement expanded rapidly from financial aid to direct military assistance, advisors, and strategic planning, transforming the Greek National Army from a poorly coordinated force into a centralized, increasingly professional military capable of sustained large-scale operations while tying its survival to U.S. priorities that emphasize stability, anti-communism, and control over political outcomes rather than reconciliation. This shift altered the nature of the war on the ground, as counterinsurgency doctrine replaced ad hoc responses. Air power was deployed against guerrilla positions, and forced population relocations were used to deny insurgent support, a strategy that prioritized military effectiveness over civilian welfare and further entrenched fear within rural communities. The Democratic Army of Greece, drawn largely from communist resistance veterans and rural supporters marginalized after the war, found itself increasingly isolated as the conflict escalated, because while it possessed experience, motivation, and local knowledge, it lacked the heavy weaponry, air support, and secure supply lines necessary to match a state backed by a superpower. Regional dynamics compounded this imbalance, as Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria provided varying degrees of sanctuary and assistance. Yet these channels were politically fragile and vulnerable to shifts in broader socialist politics, particularly as relations between socialist states themselves became strained. The insurgents' dependence on cross-border support exposed them to strategic vulnerability because any disruption in external backing could not be compensated domestically, revealing how insurgent movements embedded in Cold War contexts were often more constrained by geopolitics than by local conditions. This vulnerability became acute as the war progressed, because the Greek government's growing strength allowed it to concentrate forces, isolate rebel-held areas, and exploit divisions within the insurgent leadership over strategy and timing, divisions that reflected the tension between revolutionary ambition and the reality of dwindling resources. Internally, the war produced a cycle of repression and retaliation that hardened social divisions beyond repair. As loyalty was policed through fear, villages were emptied or relocated, and political identity became a matter of survival rather than belief, embedding trauma into everyday life and ensuring that neutrality was impossible. The use of emergency laws, special courts, and mass detentions by the government, justified as necessary for national survival, entrenched authoritarian practices that would shape Greek political culture long after the war ended, demonstrating how Cold War conflicts often produced security states whose logic outlasted the immediate threat. The insurgents, facing mounting pressure, adopted increasingly desperate measures, including compulsory recruitment and harsh discipline, eroding popular support and reinforcing the government's narrative that rebellion equaled chaos, a dynamic that illustrates how prolonged conflict can corrode the legitimacy of all sides. The international framing of the war amplified these outcomes, as the conflict was increasingly presented abroad as a clear-cut struggle between democracy and totalitarianism, obscuring the complex social and historical roots of the violence and narrowing diplomatic space for negotiated settlement. This framing mattered because it foreclosed compromise, as any political solution that included communist participation was portrayed as unacceptable, ensuring that the war would end only through military defeat rather than political accommodation. By 1948, the Greek Civil War had become one of the bloodiest conflicts in post-war Europe, not in terms of absolute numbers, but in proportion to population, with widespread displacement, economic devastation, and a generation marked by exile and imprisonment. Yet even as the fighting reached its peak, the outcome was increasingly determined not by battlefield heroism, but by the structural realities of Cold War power, as American-backed government forces possessed the capacity to sustain pressure indefinitely while insurgents faced tightening constraints. This imbalance revealed a central lesson of the Cold War, that internal conflicts in strategically valued states would be resolved less by domestic consensus than by the preferences and resources of external patrons, a lesson that would echo across Asia, Africa, and Latin America in the decades to come, and that Greece learned first at immense cost. By 1949, the Greek Civil War was entering its final and most decisive phase, shaped less by ideology or popular mobilization than by the cumulative weight of external alignment, logistical dominance, and strategic isolation, because the conflict had reached a point where outcomes were dictated by who could sustain pressure rather than who could command loyalty. And in this contest, the imbalance was now overwhelming. The Greek government forces, reorganized and expanded under American guidance, launched a series of coordinated offensives designed to eliminate remaining insurgent strongholds, employing superior numbers, air support, and mobility to deny guerrilla forces the ability to regroup or maneuver, while cutting off access to food, recruits, and sanctuary. These operations were conducted with an intensity that reflected not only military urgency, but political finality, as Washington and Athens alike sought a decisive end that would remove Greece permanently from the list of Cold War uncertainties. For the Democratic Army of Greece, the situation deteriorated rapidly, as strategic options narrowed and dependence on external support became a critical liability, particularly after Yugoslavia's break with the Soviet bloc disrupted supply routes and sanctuary that had been essential to sustaining the insurgency. This rupture illustrated how internal Cold War fractures could decisively affect local conflicts, as shifts in alliance politics beyond Greece's borders translated directly into battlefield defeat, reinforcing the lesson that proxy forces were often hostages to geopolitical currents they could not control. Deprived of reliable external support and facing relentless pressure, insurgent units retreated into increasingly inhospitable terrain, where survival became a daily struggle and cohesion eroded under constant attack, leading to defections, desertions, and the gradual collapse of organized resistance. The final battles were brutal and conclusive, marked by overwhelming firepower and the systematic dismantling of remaining guerrilla formations, leaving little doubt about the war's outcome, even before it officially ended. When the fighting ceased later that year, it did so not through negotiation or reconciliation, but through exhaustion and defeat, cementing a victory that was military in form but deeply political in consequence. The end of the war did not bring immediate peace to Greek society, because the mechanisms of control and suspicion built during the conflict remained firmly in place. As emergency laws persisted, political prisoners filled camps and prisons, and exile became a defining experience for tens of thousands, ensuring that the war's legacy extended far beyond the battlefield. The post-war state that emerged was stable in its alignment but fragile in its legitimacy, reliant on security services, censorship, and political exclusion to maintain order, reflecting the enduring imprint of a conflict resolved through force rather than consensus. This outcome mattered profoundly for the Cold War, because Greece became a showcase for containment achieved through intervention, reinforcing the belief that decisive external support could shape internal outcomes and prevent perceived ideological expansion. A belief that would inform U.S. policy in numerous later conflicts with far more ambiguous results. At the same time, the war exposed the costs of such victories, as the suppression of alternative political currents delayed democratic development and left unresolved social divisions that would resurface in later crises, including authoritarian rule and political upheaval decades after the guns fell silent. Internationally, the Greek Civil War helped solidify the emerging bipolar order, demonstrating that Europe's post-war future would be shaped not only by reconstruction and integration, but by the willingness of superpowers to intervene directly in domestic conflicts deemed strategically significant. It also set a precedent for how internal wars would be framed and justified, as complex social struggles were recast as ideological showdowns to legitimize intervention and suppress dissent. In this sense, the war's conclusion marked both an end and a beginning, closing one of the last violent chapters of post-war European upheaval, while opening a new era in which the Cold War would be fought through internal conflicts, whose outcomes were determined as much by global alignment as by local realities. Greece's experience thus became a foundational case study in Cold War history, revealing how early the patterns of proxy warfare, security state governance, and externalized decision-making were established, and how deeply they would shape the world that followed. The aftermath of the Greek Civil War revealed how thoroughly the conflict had reshaped the country's political, social, and strategic foundations. Because the end of fighting did not dissolve the divisions created by years of violence, but instead froze them into institutions, laws, and collective memory, ensuring that the war's consequences would persist long after the battlefield fell silent. The victorious state consolidated its authority through an extensive security apparatus, justifying continued repression as a necessary safeguard against renewed instability, while political life was tightly controlled to prevent the reemergence of leftist movements, embedding a culture of surveillance and exclusion that constrained democratic development. Tens of thousands of former insurgents and sympathizers were imprisoned, exiled, or barred from public life, creating a legacy of marginalization that affected families and communities for generations and reinforced the perception that the post-war order had been imposed rather than chosen. This reliance on coercion reflected the unresolved nature of the conflict, as victory had been achieved militarily but not socially, leaving grievances unaddressed and trust shattered. Economically, the war compounded the devastation already inflicted by occupation and famine, delaying recovery and tying reconstruction closely to external assistance, particularly from the United States, whose aid programs further integrated Greece into the Western Bloc while reinforcing dependency on foreign support. This integration brought stability and growth over time, yet it also entrenched a political alignment that limited autonomy and framed dissent as a threat to national security, illustrating how Cold War victories often came with long-term trade-offs between stability and sovereignty. The social fabric bore deep scars, as communities fractured by wartime loyalties struggled to reconcile, and silence became a survival strategy, with memories of the conflict suppressed rather than processed, creating a collective amnesia that masked trauma without healing it. This suppression mattered because unresolved memory can shape political culture as powerfully as ideology, fostering cynicism, fear, and disengagement that persist beneath the surface of formal institutions. Internationally, the Greek Civil War's outcome reinforced confidence in containment as a workable strategy, encouraging policymakers to believe that decisive intervention could prevent ideological expansion and stabilize fragile states, a belief that would later be tested with far more ambiguous results in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Greece thus became both a model and a warning, demonstrating that while external power could shape outcomes, it could not easily repair the social damage caused by civil war and repression. The war also influenced the architecture of Western security, as Greece's alignment contributed to the consolidation of alliances and the militarization of political boundaries in southeastern Europe, reinforcing the idea that stability required firm control over internal politics, as well as borders. For the Eastern Bloc, the conflict served as a cautionary tale about the risks of overextension and the limits of support for insurgent movements in strategically sensitive regions, reinforcing a more cautious approach to intervention in Europe, even as proxy warfare expanded elsewhere. Over time, the Greek Civil War receded from international attention, overshadowed by larger crises and wars, yet its lessons remained embedded in Cold War practice, shaping assumptions about legitimacy, intervention, and the management of internal conflict. The endurance of these lessons underscores how early Cold War experiences set patterns that would define the era, often before doctrines were formally articulated or strategies fully understood. In Greece, the long shadow of the Civil War would resurface in later political upheavals, reminding the country that the past had never been fully resolved and that the structures built to secure victory could themselves become sources of instability. The post-war order thus reflected the paradox at the heart of Cold War peace, that stability achieved through force and exclusion can endure for decades, yet remains vulnerable to the unresolved tensions it suppresses, a reality first revealed in Greece and repeated across the world. The Greek Civil War's deeper significance becomes clearer when placed within the broader evolution of Cold War doctrine, because the conflict demonstrated at an early stage that the emerging bipolar order would tolerate internal repression and political exclusion, so long as strategic alignment was secured, establishing a precedent in which sovereignty was conditional and democracy secondary to geopolitical reliability. Greece's post-war trajectory revealed how victory in a Cold War-framed civil conflict often produced a state optimized for security rather than inclusion, where loyalty was measured through ideological conformity and dissent equated with existential threat, shaping institutions that prioritized control over consensus. This orientation influenced military planning, policing, education, and public discourse, embedding anti-communism as a defining principle of national identity and legitimizing extraordinary measures as permanent safeguards rather than temporary necessities. The persistence of these structures reflected the unresolved nature of the war, as the absence of reconciliation meant that political competition remained constrained by fear of recurrence, reinforcing cycles of mistrust that limited the possibility of pluralism. The Cold War environment amplified this dynamic because Greece's strategic value ensured continued external support despite internal shortcomings, signaling that alignment could shield regimes from scrutiny and accountability, a lesson absorbed by governments across the developing world. This shielding effect weakened incentives for reform and contributed to periodic authoritarian relapse, demonstrating how Cold War stability often rested on brittle foundations that could fracture when pressures accumulated. The Greek experience thus illustrates how early containment successes carried hidden costs, as the suppression of political alternatives delayed social healing and preserved fault lines that later re-emerged in moments of crisis, including periods of authoritarian rule that undermined democratic legitimacy. Internationally, the war's outcome reinforced a simplified narrative of Cold War victory that obscured complexity, encouraging policymakers to view internal conflicts through ideological binaries that ignored social realities and overestimated the efficacy of military solutions. This narrative would shape interventionist thinking for decades, as Greece was cited as proof that decisive action could prevent ideological takeover, even as the long-term consequences of such action were seldom examined. The Civil War also left a legacy of silence and contested memory, as official histories emphasized national salvation while marginalizing alternative experiences, ensuring that the conflict remained unresolved not only politically but culturally, influencing how subsequent generations understood authority, resistance, and belonging. This contested memory underscores how Cold War conflicts did not end when fighting stopped, but continued through narratives, exclusions, and institutional practices that shaped national life. Greece's case reveals that the Cold War's most durable effects were often internal rather than external, altering the relationship between state and society in ways that outlasted the global rivalry itself. The Civil War thus stands as a foundational episode in understanding how Cold War power operated at the domestic level, transforming social divisions into strategic vulnerabilities and resolving them through force rather than dialogue. Its lessons remain relevant because they expose the moral and political trade-offs embedded in a system that prioritized stability over justice, demonstrating that the Cold War's apparent order was built on compromises that left deep scars within the societies it claimed to protect. The final legacy of the Greek Civil War lies in how it revealed the true mechanics of the Cold War at its inception, because Greece showed that the post-war world would be ordered not only through treaties and alliances, but through the active shaping of internal political outcomes, where social fracture became a strategic liability and external power intervened to determine which futures were permitted to exist. The war demonstrated that Cold War stability was built as much on suppression as on deterrence, as victory required not merely defeating an armed opponent, but restructuring society to prevent the return of alternative political paths, embedding fear, exclusion, and surveillance into the foundations of the state. This outcome ensured alignment and short-term order, yet it also delayed reconciliation and democratic normalization, leaving Greece with unresolved divisions that resurfaced decades later, and reminding observers that conflicts ended by force often persist beneath the surface long after they disappear from headlines. Internationally, the Greek Civil War became a formative reference point, reinforcing the belief that early, decisive intervention could prevent ideological expansion, a belief that shaped Cold War policy across the globe, even as later conflicts revealed its limits and costs. Greece's experience thus stands as the first clear example of the Cold War's central paradox, that peace between great powers was often achieved by permitting and even managing violence within smaller states, accepting repression and social fracture as the price of geopolitical order. In understanding the Greek Civil War, we see the Cold War stripped of abstraction and revealed in its most human form, as a system that transformed post-war hope into prolonged division and taught the world that the battle for influence would be fought not only at borders but inside societies themselves, leaving legacies that endured long after the global rivalry had moved on.